If you have ever worked yourself past the point of feeling anything, past the point where your body forgets to warn you before it fails, then you already know how this story begins. It begins with a woman collapsing in an empty office at 11:40 at night, and a man who was never supposed to be more than her driver catching her before she hit the floor. Stay with me until the end, because what happens between them over the next 3 months will remind you that the people who save us rarely look like the ones we expected. And if the story moves you even a little, hit like and subscribe, because there is a lot more heart where this came from. Ethan Cole had learned over 8 years of driving executives around the city that exhaustion has a sound. It is not dramatic, it is quiet. It is the particular way a person's breathing changes when their body is running on fumes and caffeine and sheer will. He had heard that sound in his own chest more nights than he could count, back when his wife Marissa was still alive, and they were both working 2 jobs to keep their small apartment and their newborn daughter fed. He had not expected to hear it again, 4 years after Marissa's death, coming from the woman he had spent the last 14 months quietly, professionally, invisibly protecting. Vanessa Hale was 36 years old and ran one of the fastest-growing fintech companies on the East Coast. She had built Hale Innovations from a 3-person startup in a rented basement into a company valued at $900 million, and she had done it almost entirely alone, because the one time she had let someone in, her former fiancé, who turned out to be feeding confidential information to a rival firm, it had cost her nearly everything. Since then, she trusted almost no one. She trusted her lawyers, she trusted her numbers, and, without ever quite admitting it to herself, she trusted the quiet man who drove her home every night and never once asked her a personal question. Ethan's days followed a rhythm most people never saw. He woke at 5 to get Lily fed and dressed and dropped at his sister's house before her school bus came, because his shift started at 7 and rarely ended before midnight. He kept protein bars and a spare hair tie in the glove box for Lily's emergencies, and a second set for Vanessa's, though he would not have admitted, in those early months, that he had started noticing the difference between the two. That Vanessa's emergencies were rarely about food or sleep, but about the particular kind of hunger that comes from running a company that never lets you stop proving yourself. He had taken the driving job 3 years earlier because the hours, brutal as they were, paid enough to keep Lily in the good school district, and left him just enough energy on the good days to read her a bedtime story before he collapsed himself. He was not looking for anything more than a paycheck and a quiet life. He had told himself that so many times it had almost become true. That Tuesday night, the board was 3 days away from a vote that could strip her of controlling interest in her own company. A rival investor named Marcus Chen had spent 6 months quietly buying up shares through shell companies, and Vanessa had spent 6 months trying to stay 2 steps ahead of him, sleeping 4 hours a night, sometimes less. Her assistant had gone home at 9. The cleaning crew had come and gone, and at 11:40, standing at her floor-to-ceiling window looking out at a city she had once believed she could conquer through sheer force of will, Vanessa Hale's legs simply stopped holding her up. Ethan had been waiting in the underground garage, as he always did, reading a paperback under the dim light of his sedan, when his phone buzzed with the security desk's message. "Motion alert, 42nd floor." No response to intercom. He was in the elevator before he finished reading the sentence. He found her on the floor beside her desk, one shoe off, her phone still lit up beside her hand with an unanswered email draft glowing on the screen. For one terrible second, his mind went somewhere he had spent 4 years trying not to visit, a memory of finding Marissa in the kitchen, too still, too quiet, and his hands were shaking when he knelt beside Vanessa and felt for her pulse. It was there, steady, if weak. She stirred faintly at his touch, murmuring something incoherent, her skin cold and clammy under the office lights. He called for a paramedic, but she came around enough to refuse one, gripping his sleeve with surprising strength and insisting, in a voice cracked from dehydration, That if word got out she had collapsed 3 days before a board vote, Marcus Chen would use it to paint her as unfit to lead. "Please," she said, and it was the first time in 14 months he had heard her say that word to anyone. "Just get me home. I just need to sleep." Against his better judgment, and he would replay this decision 100 times over the following weeks, Ethan carried her down to the car himself, rather than risk the lobby cameras catching a stretcher. She weighed almost nothing, which frightened him more than anything else that night. In the elevator, her head rested against his shoulder, and he could feel every uneven breath she took, could smell the faint trace of the coffee she'd been living on for days. Her penthouse had no one in it, no housekeeper on call at that hour, no family listed as an emergency contact in the file Ethan technically wasn't supposed to have read, but had, once in the early days, to know who to call if anything ever happened to her. There was no one. A woman who employed 400 people and who newspapers described as untouchable and ruthlessly self-sufficient did not have a single person she could call at midnight when her body gave out. He carried her inside, laid her carefully on top of her bed, pulled a blanket over her, left a glass of water and 2 protein bars on the nightstand, and sat in the armchair across the room. Not because propriety demanded it, though it did, but because some old instinct in him, the one that used to sit up all night watching Marissa's oxygen monitor during her final illness, would not let him leave a sick woman alone in an empty apartment. He told himself he would wait until she woke up enough to confirm she was stable, and then he would go. He fell asleep in the chair around 2 in the morning. When Vanessa Hale opened her eyes at 6, disoriented, unsure for a moment where she was or how she had gotten there, she reached instinctively for the only solid, warm thing within reach: Ethan's hand, which had fallen against the edge of the mattress as he slept. She held on to it for nearly a full minute before she was awake enough to understand whose hand it was. And by then, something in her chest had already shifted, quietly and without her permission. She did not let go right away. When she finally did, and Ethan startled awake to find her staring at him with an expression he could not read, somewhere between mortification and something gentler. The silence that followed lasted almost 30 seconds. It was Vanessa who broke it, sitting up too fast, immediately regretting it as the room spun and saying in the brisk, controlled voice she used in board meetings, "This does not happen again, ever. I don't need anyone. I need you to forget this." Ethan, who had buried a wife and was raising an 8-year-old daughter, named Lily entirely alone, who understood better than almost anyone what it cost a person to say, "I don't need anyone," while their body was actively falling apart, simply nodded and said, "Understood, Ms. Hale," and drove her to a private urgent care clinic for an IV drip before work, and never once brought it up again. But something had changed, even if neither of them said so. Over the following weeks, small things shifted between them. Vanessa began asking Ethan's opinion on things she had never asked anyone. Not business, never business, but small human things. Whether the flowers in the lobby smelled too strong. Whether he thought the rain would let up by evening. She noticed, for the first time in 14 months, that he kept a dog-eared photograph of a little girl tucked into the visor of the car. And one evening, uncharacteristically, she asked about her. Ethan told her about Lily, 7, going on 30, who had inherited her mother's stubbornness and her father's quiet patience, who was struggling that semester because her school had scheduled a Father's Day art project, and none of the other kids' assignments involved a framed photograph of someone who had passed away. He told her briefly about Marissa, about the illness that took 11 months and every ounce of savings they had, about the nights he had learned to recognize the sound of a person too exhausted to keep fighting. Vanessa listened without interrupting, which was, for her, an act of extraordinary vulnerability. And 2 days later, without telling Ethan, she called Lily's school, spoke to the principal under a name that was not her own, and quietly arranged for a small assembly where children who had lost a parent could share memories instead of art projects about people who were still alive. Ethan found out only when Lily came home glowing, telling him that a nice lady had made sure her project about mommy could be about photos instead of drawings, because not everyone's mommy is here to draw with them, and that's okay too. He did not need to ask who the nice lady was. Not everyone in Vanessa's orbit was pleased by the change in her. Diane Whitfield, the company's chief operating officer and one of Vanessa's oldest colleagues, noticed within a month that the CEO had started leaving the office before 9, that she smiled at her phone in meetings, that the perpetual, brittle tension in her shoulders had eased just slightly. Diane had spent a decade positioning herself as Vanessa's closest ally, and had quietly hoped that when Vanessa finally burned out, as Diane privately believed she eventually would, she would be the one trusted to step into the vacuum. A softer, happier Vanessa was not a threat to the company. It was a threat to Diane's ambitions. It was Diane who first raised, in a closed-door meeting with 2 board members, the optics concern of the CEO's driver spending unusual hours at her residence, phrasing it with just enough plausible deniability to sound like concern for governance rather than what it actually was. An attempt to manufacture a scandal before Chen's takeover attempt could be defeated on its own. She did not know about the collapse. She did not know about Lily. She knew only what a building's security logs could tell her, and she used it the way a knife is used, quietly and precisely, hoping no one would notice the hand that held it until it was too late for Vanessa to recover. Vanessa found out about the meeting from an ally on the board 2 days before it would have become a formal inquiry, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, she considered doing what she had always done when threatened: cutting Ethan loose, quietly, before anyone could use him against her, protecting the company the way she had protected it for 14 years, alone. She actually drafted the termination letter, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same clinical efficiency she used for every difficult decision, careful language about restructuring and reassignment that would have fooled no one who read between the lines. She stared at it for 40 minutes before she deleted it, because she realized, with a clarity that frightened her more than Chen ever had, that the version of herself who would have sent that letter without hesitation a year earlier was not a version of herself she wanted to go back to being. Instead, she called an emergency meeting of her own, not to fire Ethan, but to remind Diane and the 2 board members in that room, in language so precise and so quietly furious that no one in the room ever raised the subject again, that her personal life was not a governance concern so long as it did not violate a single policy in the employee handbook, and that if anyone wished to formally allege otherwise, she would welcome the inquiry, publicly, with her legal team and the full weight of her 14 years of clean audits behind her. No one took her up on the offer. The weeks that followed brought Vanessa's company crisis to a head. Marcus Chen's hostile takeover attempt culminated in an emergency board meeting where he presented falsified performance reports designed to make Vanessa appear reckless and unstable, quietly leaking, through an anonymous source, a distorted account of her medical incident weeks earlier, twisted into a narrative about a CEO too fragile to lead. It was Ethan, working off the books through a private investigator he trusted from his years in corporate security, who uncovered the paper trail proving Chen had fabricated 2 of the 3 reports and had been trading on insider information obtained through a mole in Vanessa's own legal department. The night before the vote, Vanessa sat alone in her office at 9 in the evening, earlier than usual because Ethan had quietly insisted, and she had, for the first time, listened, staring at the evidence spread across her desk, terrified that even the truth might not be enough to save 14 years of her life's work. Ethan found her there not because security alerted him, but because he had simply known, the way you know the people who matter to you, that she would still be at her desk long after she should have gone home. He did not carry her out that night. Instead, he sat across from her, poured 2 cups of the terrible office coffee, and told her the same thing he told himself on the worst nights after Marissa died, that surviving something does not require you to survive it alone, and that the strongest thing he had ever done was not gritting his teeth through his wife's illness in silence, It was finally calling his sister for help when he could not manage a newborn and a graveyard shift and a hospital room all at once. "You don't lose credibility by needing people, Vanessa," he said. "You lose yourself by pretending you don't." Sit. The morning of the vote, the boardroom was colder than usual. 30 floors above the city, sunlight cutting hard lines across a table where careers were about to be decided. Marcus Chen arrived 20 minutes early, unnervingly calm, certain the leaked story about Vanessa's medical incident had already done its damage among the more risk-averse board members. He was not wrong to be confident. 2 board members who had backed Vanessa for years sat that morning with folders unopened, faces unreadable, the particular stillness of people who have already decided to abandon a sinking ship and are simply waiting for the polite moment to announce it. Vanessa stood to speak first, as was her right as CEO, and for one heartbeat, watching 30 years of her life's work balanced on a single vote, she felt the old instinct rise, to be flawless, untouchable, to perform strength so completely that no one in the room would dare doubt her. Then she looked at the empty chair Ethan was not permitted to sit in, technically an outsider to the meeting, waiting instead just outside the boardroom doors with the folder of evidence his investigator had spent 3 sleepless weeks assembling. And she chose something harder than performing strength. She chose honesty. 3 weeks ago, I collapsed from exhaustion in this building, she told the room, before Chen could weaponize the rumor first. I am not going to pretend that didn't happen, and I am not going to let anyone in this room use it to distract from what actually matters this morning, which is that Marcus Chen fabricated 2 of the 3 reports in front of you, using information stolen by a mole in my own legal department. She won the vote that morning, by a wider margin than even she had expected. The evidence Ethan's investigator uncovered was presented not by Vanessa, who understood by then that her voice alone might not be believed, but by 3 board members she had quietly, deliberately built trust with over the previous weeks. The first time in her career she had let anyone else carry part of the weight for her. Marcus Chen resigned from the board within the month, and the mole in her legal department was quietly, legally, thoroughly dealt with. That evening, for the first time since the night she had collapsed, Vanessa asked Ethan to stay, not as her driver, not as an employee working overtime, but simply to stay in the small kitchen of her enormous, echoing penthouse, and eat the terrible microwave dinner she had somehow never learned to cook better than. They talked for 3 hours about nothing important. About Lily's stubborn streak, about the very first year of Hale Innovations when Vanessa slept on a beanbag chair in her own office. About Marissa's laugh, which Ethan said he still heard sometimes in Lily's. And for the first time since her fiancé's betrayal, Vanessa Hale let herself want something she could not entirely control the outcome of. There was one night, in the middle of all of it, when it very nearly fell apart before it had properly begun. Vanessa's oldest friend from business school, Priya, had flown in for a conference and taken her out for the first real dinner Vanessa had allowed herself in months. 2 glasses of wine in, loosened in a way she rarely let herself be, Vanessa had laughed off Priya's teasing about the driver situation with the old practice deflection she had used on every relationship question for a decade. I don't do relationships, Priya. I do results. Whatever this is, it's not going to become something. I don't have the bandwidth to be someone's soft place to land, and he deserves someone who can be that. She had not known Ethan was in the restaurant's private hallway, waiting to drive her home, close enough to hear every word through a door left carelessly ajar. He did not confront her. He drove her home in silence, walked her to her door as he always did, and then, for the first time in months, he pulled back, canceled the following Friday's dinner with Lily that Vanessa had started attending, answered her texts with the clipped, professional courtesy he had used the first year he worked for her, put the wall back up brick by brick. It took Vanessa 4 days to understand what had happened, and when she finally pieced it together, she did something she had not done for another human being since her mother died. She showed up, unannounced and unscheduled, at his small apartment on a Tuesday evening, and stood in the hallway apologizing before he had even fully opened the door. "I say things like that because it's easier than admitting I'm terrified," she told him, standing in a hallway that smelled like Lily's crayons and whatever Ethan had burned trying to cook dinner. "I have never once in my life let someone see me need them and not had it used against me. I said it to protect myself from a version of this that could actually break me if it went wrong. That's not the same as not wanting it." Ethan listened, the way he always did. And then he told her simply that he was not asking her to have no fear, only to stop letting the fear speak for her when it mattered most. It was the closest either of them had come, up to that point, to saying the word neither had used yet. It took another 2 months after that before either of them said the word out loud, both still careful, both still aware of what they each stood to lose. It was Lily in the end who forced the conversation, greeting Vanessa at the door of their small apartment one Saturday, where Vanessa had come ostensibly to drop off paperwork Ethan had left behind, with the blunt, unfiltered honesty of a 7-year-old. "Are you going to be my other mom now? Because Dad smiles a lot more since you started coming around, and I like it." Vanessa Hale, who had once told a board of 30 investors she felt nothing when her own engagement collapsed publicly in the press, found herself crying in a doorway in front of an 8-year-old, and Ethan, standing behind his daughter with his heart in his throat, finally said the thing he had been afraid to say since the night, months earlier, when he found a note of Marissa's tucked in an old coat pocket while packing away winter clothes. A note written in the last weeks of her illness, when she still had the strength to hold a pen, telling him that she did not want him to spend the rest of his life keeping a chair empty at the table in her memory, that grief was allowed to make room for something new without erasing what came before it. He had folded that note and carried it in his wallet for 2 years, without showing anyone, not even Lily, because reading it made real a permission he had not been ready to accept. Standing in that doorway, watching Vanessa cry in front of his daughter, he finally understood what Marissa had been trying to tell him, that loving again was not a betrayal of loving before. It was proof that the love had been real enough to teach him how. They did not rush it. Vanessa spent that first year learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be present in small, ordinary ways. The first school play she attended, a chaotic second-grade production about the water cycle in which Lily played a slightly too enthusiastic raindrop. She sat in a folding metal chair between 2 other parents who had no idea she ran a company worth $900 million, and she found herself crying during a scene where the raindrop fell from a cardboard cloud into a construction paper ocean, not because the play was moving, but because she had never once, in 36 years, sat in an audience for someone simply because she loved them and expected nothing in return. Afterward, Lily ran to her before she ran to Ethan, arms out, glitter still stuck to her cheeks, and asked if Vanessa had seen her fall, and Vanessa said she had seen every second of it, and meant it more than she had meant almost anything she'd said in a boardroom in a decade. She learned to braid hair badly first, then less badly, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor on Sunday mornings, while Ethan made pancakes and pretended not to watch the 2 of them in the reflection of the microwave door, memorizing the sight of it the way a man memorizes something he is afraid might not last. Lily taught her card games with rules that changed conveniently whenever Lily was losing, and Vanessa, who negotiated multi-million-dollar term sheets without blinking, always somehow lost graciously to an 8-year-old's shifting definition of Uno. There was, too, a night early in that year when Ethan attended one of Vanessa's world instead of the reverse. The company's annual investor gala, black tie, the kind of room he had spent years driving other people to and never once entering. He stood at the edge of it in a borrowed suit, uncomfortable in his own skin among executives who measured worth in stock options, until Vanessa crossed the entire ballroom in front of her own board, in front of Marcus Chen's replacement and half the city's financial press, and took his hand in a room full of people who had spent months speculating about her personal life behind closed doors. She did not explain herself to anyone that night. She did not need to. For a woman who had spent 14 years terrified of being perceived as anything less than untouchable, it was the single bravest thing she did that entire year. Braver, in its own quiet way, than any boardroom victory. She stepped back from 80-hour weeks, not because ambition left her, but because she finally understood what Ethan had tried to tell her that night before the vote. That the version of success worth having was one you had people to come home to. A year to the day after the night he had carried her to bed and woken with her hand around his, Ethan drove Vanessa home from the office one final time, his final shift as her driver, because she had, over her lawyer's quiet objections and to the astonishment of her board, promoted him to head of corporate security, a role that finally paid him what his skill and loyalty had always been worth, and that let him build a life instead of merely surviving one. In the elevator up to what was now, unmistakably, their apartment, Lily's crayon drawings taped haphazardly beside Vanessa's framed business awards, Vanessa reached for his hand the way she had that first disoriented morning, except this time she was wide awake, and she knew exactly whose hand she was holding, and she never once considered letting go. Diane Whitfield left the company 8 months later, for a role at a rival firm that offered her the title she had always wanted, and Vanessa, to the surprise of everyone who expected her to hold a grudge, wrote her a fair and generous reference, because she had learned, somewhere in that year, that the version of success worth wanting did not require anyone else's downfall to feel earned. Lily started calling Vanessa Nessa that spring, then, quietly and without ceremony one night at the dinner table, simply Mom. And nobody in that small apartment corrected her, because nobody wanted to. Some people believe that strength means needing no one. Vanessa Hale spent 14 years believing that too, until an ordinary Tuesday night and one quiet, steady man taught her the harder, truer lesson, that the bravest thing a person can do is let themselves be caught.